In the dim glow of chandeliers, the soft hum of conversation blended with the gentle clinking of glasses. It was a world defined by opulence, where the air carried the unmistakable weight of privilege. Here, every detail was polished to perfection, every movement rehearsed to maintain an air of seamless elegance. Among the flowing gowns and tailored suits, the waitstaff moved silently, their presence barely acknowledged. They were shadows in a place where the spotlight shone only on the chosen few. But on this particular night, one server's steps seemed to slow, a slight hesitation, barely perceptible, yet impossible to ignore by those who paid attention. He approached a table in the far corner, where the laughter was louder than the rest. It was the kind of table often reserved for those who believed their place in the world was unquestionable. The source of the laughter, a figure seated at the center, spoke with a voice that commanded attention, her words cutting through the hum of the room. The server paused, tray balanced in his hands as her voice reached him. "What is it you do, again?" she asked, her tone light, almost playful, yet probing. A ripple of curiosity passed through the surrounding diners. Heads turned subtly, the silence in that corner of the room sharpening. He stood still for a moment, his eyes fixed downward, as if weighing the weight of her words. "They say you're a dancer," she continued, a faint smirk in her voice. "Why don't you show us? Give us a little performance." The server's grip on the tray tightened ever so slightly. The air in the room shifted, but no one spoke. Her words lingered, a demand cloaked as amusement, a challenge masked as harmless fun. He finally responded, his voice steady but quiet. "I'm here to serve." The laughter at the table didn't vanish entirely. It lingered, softer now, an echo of something deeper. She leaned back in her chair, studying him, as if searching for a reaction. Across the room, a few of the staff exchanged glances, their hands frozen mid-task. Near the bar, the manager watched, his expression tense but unreadable. The balance of this place, this moment, wasn't his to disrupt. The server turned away, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. But in the stillness of that room, something had shifted. What happened next would leave everyone in that room questioning what they had just witnessed. Before we begin, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you're ready for a story that will inspire and captivate you, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell so you don't miss a single powerful story. In a world where lives often intersect without intention, some moments unfold quietly while carrying the weight of something far greater. To understand what truly happened that night, we must step into the lives of the people who found themselves at the center of it, each with their own story, their own choices, and their own burdens. Jayden Williams was no stranger to hard work. Born and raised in a neighborhood where opportunities often felt just out of reach, he had learned early on that perseverance was not optional, it was survival. His days were long and unrelenting, split between shifts at the restaurant and hours in a worn-out dance studio where the mirrors were cracked, the floor uneven, and the heat stifling. But in that space, Jayden was free. Dance was his language, his escape, his way of carving out an identity that wasn't defined by the limits of his circumstances. He poured himself into every step, every turn, every leap, not because he thought it would be easy, but because he couldn't imagine doing anything else. To the diners who saw him carrying trays, Jayden was simply part of the backdrop, just another server in a neatly pressed uniform. But to those who knew him, he was a young man with extraordinary talent and a relentless spirit, someone who refused to let the world define his potential. At home, Jayden was more than just a dreamer. He was a provider. His family relied on him, especially his younger siblings, who often waited eagerly for him to return at night. Jayden's passion for dance wasn't just his own, it was a beacon of hope for those who looked up to him. Jayden's world was divided into two parts. There was the job he did to keep the lights on, and there was the dream he pursued long after most people had gone to bed. In a small rented dance studio on the edge of the city, Jayden spent countless hours rehearsing. The studio was nothing fancy, with scuffed floors and faded mirrors, but for him, it was a place of freedom. Late into the night, Long after finishing his shift at the restaurant, he would find himself alone in that room, pushing his body past exhaustion. Each step, each spin, and each leap was more than just movement. It was a testament to his determination. Jayden wasn't just dancing for the love of it. He was dancing to prove that he could rise above the limits of his circumstances. For him, every rehearsal was a small victory, a reminder that his story didn't have to end where it began. But the road wasn't easy. The exhaustion was relentless, and doubt often crept in during the quiet moments. Sitting on the studio floor, drenched in sweat, Jayden would stare into the cracked mirror and ask himself the questions that haunted him. Was he chasing an impossible dream? Was all the sacrifice worth it? "If I can't make it," he would whisper to himself, "how will they believe I can?" At home, Jayden's dreams were more than his own. He carried them for his younger sibling, Maya, who looked up to him with unwavering admiration. Maya, just 10 years old, saw her older brother as a superhero. For her, Jayden's talent wasn't just impressive, it was inspiring. One evening, after a particularly long rehearsal, Jayden returned home to find Maya William, her sister, waiting for him. In her hands, she held a makeshift trophy, crafted from paper and tape, her face glowing with pride. "I made this for you," she said, holding it out to him, "for when you win your first big competition." Jayden took the trophy, his tiredness melting away in the warmth of her gesture. "You think I'll win, huh?" he asked softly. "I know you will," Maya replied confidently. "You're the best dancer in the world." Jayden wasn't just pursuing his dream for himself. He was showing Maya that it was okay to dream big, that their circumstances didn't define what they could achieve. Her faith in him was a light that guided him through even the darkest moments. Jayden's role as a provider often made his journey feel heavier than it already was. His family depended on him, and he carried the weight of their hopes and needs alongside his own. Late at night, after his siblings had gone to bed, Jayden would sit at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. For Jayden, every decision was a balancing act. Each hour he spent chasing his dream was an hour he could have been working to provide more for his family. But giving up was never an option. Not for someone who carried not only his own aspirations, but also the expectations of those who believed in him. His mother often expressed her gratitude for everything Jayden did, but even her kind words couldn't ease the burden he felt. It wasn't just about making ends meet. It was about creating a future where his siblings wouldn't have to carry the same weight he did. Victoria Smith lived in a different world entirely. Her life was defined by abundance, comfort, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to hear the word no. From a young age, she had been surrounded by wealth, attending elite schools and traveling in circles where privilege was the norm. Everything she wanted, she got. And if something, or someone, didn't meet her expectations, it wasn't her problem. Her evenings were often spent in places like the restaurant, surrounded by friends who shared her lifestyle. To Victoria, this was just another night of indulgence, good food, good wine, and the thrill of being the center of attention. Victoria's words were often delivered with a smile, but they carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She didn't see herself as cruel, but she also didn't see the people who served her as anything more than a means to an end. Victoria had a particular knack for zeroing in on people, testing them, pushing boundaries under the guise of humor. She would never have described herself as malicious. To her, it was all harmless fun, but the people on the receiving end of her comments knew better. David Wilson had been in the restaurant business long enough to recognize trouble before it fully unfolded. As the manager, his job was to keep everything running smoothly, ensuring the diners were happy and the staff remained professional, no matter the challenges. David had seen his fair share of situations like this one. He knew the tone Victoria used, the subtle but sharp edge in her voice. He also recognized the look in Jayden's eyes, a quiet resistance that didn't break easily, but simmered beneath the surface. For David, the role of manager often meant walking a tightrope. He was a mediator, a fixer, someone who was expected to handle problems without creating ripples. But on nights like these, the tightrope felt impossibly thin. David had always prided himself on being fair to his staff, But he also understood the pressures of the restaurant's reputation. The wealthy patrons who dined there expected to be treated a certain way, and stepping in to defend a staff member against someone like Victoria was a risk he couldn't take lightly. At a nearby table, Sarah Johnson observed the room with a quiet intensity. She wasn't part of Victoria's group, nor did she stand out among the other diners, but Sarah had an eye for the details others overlooked. The way Jayden's shoulders tensed as he approached the table, the forced laughter of the other servers, and the way David lingered near the bar, watching everything unfold. Sarah had experienced enough in her own life to recognize injustice when she saw it. She had worked hard for everything she had, climbing her way into a world that didn't always feel welcoming. She had learned to pick her battles, but she had also learned when silence wasn't an option. Sarah wasn't looking to make a scene, but as she listened to the exchange at Victoria's table, she felt a familiar anger rise within her. She knew the look in Jayden's eyes, the quiet frustration of being treated as though you didn't matter. It was just another evening at the restaurant, but beneath the polished facade, choices were being made, tensions were building, and a moment was approaching, one that none of them could have predicted. The restaurant's lively hum carried on, but in one corner the atmosphere began to shift. At Victoria Smith's table, laughter bubbled over, louder than the surrounding conversations. Her group of friends, all dressed in designer outfits, leaned into their conversation, their voices carrying across the room. Victoria, seated at the center of attention, gestured toward one of the waiters who had just delivered their drinks. She wasn't finished with him. Not yet. Her eyes lingered on him, her expression a mix of amusement and curiosity, the kind that often comes from someone looking for entertainment at another's expense. As he turned to leave, her voice cut through the noise, calling him back. "Excuse me, you there?" The waiter paused, turning back to face her, his tray still balanced in one hand. "What's your name?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, her tone casual but deliberate. "Jayden, ma'am," he replied politely. Her eyebrow arched slightly. "Jayden, what?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Jayden Williams, ma'am." Victoria nodded slowly, repeating his name as though she were testing it. "Jayden Williams," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Interesting." She glanced at her friends as if sharing a private joke, then turned her attention back to him. "Jayden, I was told you're a dancer. Is that true?" Jayden shifted slightly, his tone measured. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Her smile widened, her curiosity sharpening. "Really? A dancer? That must be exciting. What kind of dancing are we talking about here? Ballet, hip-hop, or just, whatever works in the streets?" The laughter at her table quieted, replaced by a collective curiosity. Jayden didn't respond immediately. His silence seemed to amuse Victoria even more. "Don't be shy," she said, leaning forward slightly. "You must be good if it's your dream. Why don't you show us? Give us a little performance." Jayden's jaw tightened, but his expression remained neutral. He shifted his weight slightly, standing taller. "I don't think that's appropriate, ma'am," he said evenly. Her friends exchanged looks, a few of them murmuring under their breath, but Victoria wasn't deterred. "Oh, come on," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "It's all in good fun. Don't be so sensitive." The tension in the room began to thicken. At nearby tables, diners paused mid-conversation, their attention subtly turning toward the scene unfolding. Some glanced toward Jayden with quiet discomfort, while others kept their focus on their plates, unwilling to get involved. At the bar, David Wilson watched with increasing unease. As the restaurant manager, he knew moments like this could escalate quickly. His eyes darted between Jayden and Victoria, weighing his options. Stepping in might defuse the situation, but it could also risk offending Victoria, a regular patron whose influence and wealth made her a valuable client. He knew Jayden well enough to understand his quiet resilience. Jayden was one of his best employees, always professional, always composed. But David also recognized the look on his face, the subtle tightening of the jaw, the way his shoulders squared ever so slightly. It was the look of someone holding back. For David, this was the tightrope he walked every day. balancing the dignity of his staff against the expectations of those who believed their money granted them power over everything and everyone. David took a step forward, then hesitated. Would intervening help, or would it make things worse? For now, he chose to wait, watching closely, ready to act if necessary. The energy in the restaurant began to shift. At one table, a couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. At another, a group of young professionals whispered among themselves, their eyes flicking toward Victoria's table. Sarah, seated just a few tables away, clenched her hands in her lap. She had been watching since the moment Victoria called Jayden back. To her, the entire scene felt uncomfortably familiar. She recognized the dynamic playing out, the imbalance of power, the way Victoria's words were wrapped in humor but laced with something far less kind. She glanced toward Jayden, silently willing him to hold his ground. But she also knew how difficult it could be to navigate moments like this, especially in a place like this. Victoria, clearly enjoying the attention, leaned back in her chair, swirling her glass of wine. "Come on," she said, her tone playful but insistent. "Just a few moves. It's not like we're asking for a full performance. Surely you can spare a moment to entertain us?" Her friends laughed, their voices blending into the ambient noise of the restaurant. One of them added, "Yeah, let's see if you've got what it takes." Jayden's hands tightened around the edges of his tray. He glanced toward the bar, where David Wilson stood, his face unreadable. He caught Sarah's gaze briefly, though he didn't linger. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Jayden finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'm here to serve, not to perform." Victoria's smile faltered for the briefest of moments before returning, brighter and sharper than before. "Oh, don't be such a killjoy," she said, her tone shifting to something more forceful. "We're just having fun, don't make it so serious." In that moment, the room seemed divided. Some watched with quiet discomfort, unsure whether to speak up or stay silent. Others laughed along, either oblivious to the tension or choosing to ignore it. And then there were those who simply waited, unsure of what would happen next. All lingers on Jayden as he stands his ground, his expression calm but unwavering. Across the room, David takes another step forward, his mind racing as he weighs his next move. Sometimes, moments like these reveal more than we realize, not just about the people involved, but about the unspoken rules that govern places like this. And as the night continued, those rules were about to be tested in ways no one could have predicted. Jayden Williams stood in the restaurant, his refusal to perform hanging in the air like a quiet challenge. But what no one at that table knew, and what Victoria Smith never cared to ask, was the story behind his calm demeanor. To truly understand Jayden's resilience, one must first understand the life that shaped him. As Victoria Smith continued her mocking remarks, Jayden's silence wasn't born of fear or submission. It was a silence of control, of understanding that his worth didn't need to be proven in a room like this. Her words, though loud and demeaning, could not shake the foundation he had built for himself through years of sacrifice and perseverance. To the diners around him, it may have seemed like a simple refusal, but for Jayden, standing firm in that moment was about more than denying a demand. It was about holding on to the dignity he had earned, step by step, in every sleepless night and every quiet moment of self-doubt. Jayden didn't see himself as a victim in that moment. He saw himself as someone who had already won far more battles than anyone at that table could imagine. For him, Victoria's words were a test he had passed long before she ever uttered them. Jayden was more than a waiter. He was a brother, a dancer, and a fighter, someone who had learned to hold his ground, no matter who tried to push him down. And as the night went on, his quiet strength would speak louder than any words ever could. The laughter at Victoria Smith's table grew louder, echoing across the restaurant. Her attention remained fixed on Jayden Williams, who stood composed, refusing her demand for a performance. But Victoria was not accustomed to being denied. For her, amusement often came at the expense of others, and tonight she had decided that Jayden would be her source of entertainment. Victoria leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming lightly against the edge of her wineglass. The room had quieted somewhat, the conversations at nearby tables fading into a nervous murmur as diners tried to make sense of the tension. Some chose to ignore it, unwilling to acknowledge the uncomfortable dynamic unfolding before them. Others watched, curious and uneasy. Victoria's voice broke through again, louder this time. "Come on, Jayden, what's the harm? Give us a little performance, it'll be fun." Jayden remained still, his gaze steady but respectful. He had no intention of indulging her, no matter how insistent she became. But Victoria wasn't finished. She clapped her hands twice, sharply, as though summoning a performer to the stage. "Let's give him some encouragement," she said, turning to her friends. They joined in with hesitant laughter and scattered applause, following her lead even as some of them appeared uncomfortable. For a moment, the tension seemed to hang in the air, thick and unspoken. Jayden looked toward the bar, where David Wilson stood watching. The manager's face was a mix of concern and hesitation. David knew the stakes. This situation could spiral out of control if handled poorly. He wanted to intervene, to tell Victoria that her behavior was inappropriate, but the fear of offending an important customer held him back. Instead, David gave Jayden a subtle nod, a gesture that said, "It's okay, just this once." "What do you think about this moment? Have you ever been in a situation where someone underestimated you? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And if this video is speaking to you, don't forget to hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. And remember, clicking the notification bell ensures you'll never miss stories like this." David's nod was not an order but a reluctant plea, a quiet acknowledgement of the difficult position Jayden was in. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right, but in that moment it felt like the only way to diffuse the situation. Jayden inhaled deeply, steadying himself. If this was the choice he had to make to maintain peace in the room, he would do it, but on his terms. Jayden placed his tray on a nearby table and stepped into an open space. The room grew silent, the attention of every diner now fixed on him. For a few moments, he stood still, gathering himself. Then he began to move. At first, his movements were small and restrained, his body testing the space around him. It wasn't a performance, it was preparation. Victoria and her friends chuckled lightly, their laughter tinged with skepticism. But then something shifted. Jayden's steps became more deliberate, his posture more commanding. His movements, once tentative, transformed into something fluid and precise. The rhythm of his body told a story of struggle, perseverance, and resilience. Each turn, each leap, and each extension of his arms carried an emotion that words could never convey. What began as a reluctant display became something far greater. Jayden wasn't just dancing to entertain, he was reclaiming the narrative, showing the room who he truly was. The energy in the restaurant changed. Victoria's laughter faded as she leaned forward in her chair, her expression shifting from amusement to surprise. Her friends, once eager to join in her mockery, now sat in stunned silence. Jayden's movements became more intricate, blending styles and techniques with seamless precision. His dance was a fusion of contemporary storytelling and raw emotion, each movement painting a vivid picture of his journey. There was no music, only the soft sound of his shoes against the floor and the rhythmic pattern of his breathing. Without saying a word, Jayden was speaking to everyone in the room. He was showing them the countless hours of practice, the sacrifices, and the dreams that had brought him to this moment. His dance was a reflection of his life, a life filled with challenges but also with strength and determination. The diners watched in awe, their own conversations forgotten. Even the waitstaff paused, their usual hustle momentarily halted as they became absorbed in Jayden's performance. Victoria's expression was unreadable. For the first time that evening, she seemed at a loss for words. When Jayden finished, the room was silent. He stood in the center of the restaurant, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his gaze fixed ahead. For several moments, no one spoke or moved. Then slowly a few diners began to clap. The applause grew, spreading across the room until nearly everyone was on their feet. Jayden's performance had transcended the initial demand. What began as mockery had turned into something far more profound, an undeniable display of talent and humanity that left the room speechless. Victoria, still seated, clapped half-heartedly, her earlier confidence replaced by an uncomfortable awareness. Her friends exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. Meanwhile, Jayden simply nodded in acknowledgement before returning to his tray. In that moment, Jayden had done more than prove his talent. He had shifted the dynamic of the room, forcing everyone to confront their own assumptions and biases. His silence and strength spoke louder than any words ever could. Jayden returned to his duties, his head held high. For him, the performance wasn't about proving anything to Victoria or her friends. It was about staying true to himself. And as the evening continued, the memory of his dance lingered, a quiet reminder of the resilience that lies within those who refuse to be defined by others. The applause was unlike anything the restaurant had experienced before. It wasn't polite or subdued, nor was it limited to just a few tables. It was full and resounding, echoing through the space, transcending the setting of a fine dining establishment. Jayden Williams stood still for a moment, his chest rising and falling from the effort of his performance. But he didn't bask in the applause or the attention. For him, this moment wasn't about the approval of others. It was about staying true to himself. The clapping grew louder as more diners joined in, rising from their seats in admiration. Across the room, some of the waitstaff exchanged glances, their faces lighting up with pride. They had always known Jayden as a hard worker, but tonight they saw something more, something extraordinary. As the applause began to subside, a voice emerged from one of the tables near the back of the restaurant. It was clear, confident, and carried a weight that immediately drew attention. "Excuse me," the voice said. "Young man." Jayden turned slightly, his expression neutral but composed. A middle-aged man stood up from his seat, his demeanor professional, yet approachable. His tailored suit and understated confidence hinted at someone accustomed to identifying potential in others. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," the man began, stepping forward. "But what I just witnessed was remarkable." The room grew quiet again, the lingering energy of the performance now replaced by a sense of intrigue. The man continued, "I've been in the entertainment industry for over 20 years, and let me tell you, talent like yours doesn't belong in the background. It belongs on the stage." Jayden's brows furrowed slightly, his modesty keeping him from reacting too quickly. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, holding it out to him. "My name is Robert Mitchell," he said. "I'm a talent scout. I've worked with dancers, performers, and artists from all over the world. And if you're interested, I'd like to talk to you about your future." There was a collective murmur among the diners, a wave of excitement and curiosity rippling through the crowd. Some exchanged knowing smiles, others whispered to one another, speculating about what this opportunity could mean for Jayden. Victoria Smith, however, was conspicuously quiet. The confidence she had displayed earlier was now gone, replaced by a flustered expression that she couldn't entirely hide. Her gaze darted between Jayden and Robert, and for the first time that evening, she seemed unsure of herself. One of Victoria's friends leaned toward her, whispering just loud enough to be overheard. "That was incredible. You should apologize." Victoria's posture stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. Apologies were not something she gave easily, and the idea of offering one now, in front of an audience, clearly unsettled her. Jayden took a step forward, his hand reaching out to accept the business card. He held it for a moment, glancing down at the information printed on it, before meeting Robert's gaze. "Thank you, sir," he said simply, his voice steady. "I appreciate it." The simplicity of his response only added to the dignity with which he carried himself. He didn't look toward Victoria or her table, choosing instead to address the room as a whole. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to show a part of myself tonight," he said, his words deliberate and thoughtful. "Thank you for listening." His words hung in the air, met with another round of applause, this one quieter but no less heartfelt. For the diners, it was a moment of reflection, a reminder that the people they often overlooked carried stories, talents, and aspirations far beyond what they could imagine. Victoria sat frozen in her seat, her carefully curated composure slipping with every passing second. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her, the silent judgment of those who had witnessed her earlier behavior. Her friends avoided her gaze, their own discomfort evident. One of them spoke up again, this time louder. "You really should apologize, Victoria. You were out of line." Victoria inhaled sharply, her pride warring with the growing realization that she had lost control of the evening. She looked toward Jayden, who was now speaking quietly with Robert Mitchell near the bar. For a moment, it seemed as though she might stand, but instead, she sank back into her chair, choosing silence over acknowledgement. David Wilson, the restaurant manager, watched from his post near the bar, his thoughts a mix of relief and admiration. He had been prepared to step in earlier, to try to diffuse the situation, but Jayden had handled it with a grace and strength that left him in awe. For David, the evening was a reminder of why he had always respected Jayden. It wasn't just his work ethic or his talent, it was his unwavering sense of self. In a place where so many voices tried to dictate his worth, Jayden had always stayed grounded in who he was. David stepped forward as Jayden approached, offering him a small but genuine smile. "You handled that well," he said quietly. "I'm proud of you." Jayden nodded, his gratitude evident in his expression. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson," he replied. The evening had taken a turn no one could have anticipated. What began as an attempt to belittle and humiliate had transformed into something far greater, a moment of recognition, of humanity, and of potential. For Jayden, it wasn't just about proving himself. It was about standing firm in his identity, even in the face of adversity. And for those who bore witness, it was a moment they would not soon forget. As the evening began to wind down, the energy in the restaurant had shifted. What had started as an ordinary night filled with the sounds of conversation and clinking glasses had transformed into something far more significant. Jayden Williams had stood his ground, not through confrontation, but through the quiet power of his talent and dignity. And now, the echoes of his performance were creating ripples far beyond the walls of the restaurant. After the applause had faded and the diners began to settle back into their meals, Jayden quietly made his way to the bar. Robert Mitchell, the talent scout, was waiting for him. They spoke briefly, their conversation private, but the sense of possibility was clear. Robert handed Jayden another card, this one with personal contact information and the details of an upcoming audition. "I want to see what you can do in a professional setting," Robert said. "You've got something special, and I don't say that lightly." Jayden nodded, his voice steady as he replied, "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down, sir." For Jayden, this was more than an opportunity. It was validation of everything he had worked for, the late nights, the sacrifices, and the quiet determination that had carried him through countless challenges. Over the next few days, Jayden began to prepare. He returned to the studio where he had spent so many hours practicing alone, this time with a renewed sense of purpose. He danced not just for himself, but for his younger sibling, Maya, who watched from the sidelines with wide-eyed admiration. Meanwhile, Victoria Smith was grappling with the events of that night. She had listened to her friend's advice and decided to apologize to Jayden before leaving the restaurant. Approaching him as he stood near the bar, she hesitated, her usual confidence replaced by an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "Jayden," she began, her voice quieter than anyone in the room had heard it before. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I was out of line." Jayden looked at her, his expression calm but unreadable. After a brief pause, he nodded and replied simply, "Thank you, ma'am." Victoria didn't linger. She turned and left the restaurant quickly, the weight of her actions settling heavily on her shoulders. For Victoria, seeing Jayden and Robert together was a humbling reminder of what she had nearly overshadowed. Her usual confidence, once a shield against reflection, had been replaced by a quiet awareness of her own shortcomings. While Jayden prepared for his audition and Victoria reflected on her behavior, another thread of the story began to unfold. One of the diners that evening, a woman named Sarah, had been deeply moved by what she witnessed. She couldn't stop thinking about Jayden's performance, about the quiet dignity with which he had handled a difficult situation. Sarah decided to share the story on social media. She wrote a post describing the events of that night, highlighting Jayden's talent and courage. "Last night I saw something extraordinary," she began. A young man reminded an entire room of what strength and grace looked like, even in the face of disrespect. The post included a short video Sarah had taken during Jayden's performance, his movements captivating even on a small screen. Within hours, the post began to gain traction. Comments poured in from people expressing their admiration for Jayden and their anger at the behavior he had endured. What began as a simple post quickly turned into something much larger. Jayden's story resonated with people across the world, those who had faced similar challenges, those who admired his resilience, and those who simply recognized the power of his talent. The video was shared thousands of times, reaching news outlets and sparking conversations about respect, privilege, and the untapped potential of those often overlooked. Back at the restaurant, David Wilson, the manager, watched the story unfold with a mixture of pride and hope. He had always believed in Jayden, but seeing the world recognize his talent was something else entirely. He reached out to Robert Mitchell, eager to support Jayden in any way he could. "Let me know if there's anything he needs," David said during their conversation. "I'll do whatever it takes to help him succeed." As the days turned into weeks, Jayden's story continued to spread, inspiring countless people to reflect on their own behavior and assumptions. For Jayden, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with opportunities he had worked so hard to create for himself. Jayden Williams' story was more than just a moment of triumph. It was a reminder of the power of resilience, the importance of treating others with respect, and the extraordinary potential that lies within those who refuse to give up. For the diners who had witnessed that night firsthand, and for those who had only heard the story online, it was an experience they wouldn't soon forget. And for Jayden, it was a step closer to the future he had always dreamed of, a future where his talent and his story could inspire others to chase their own dreams, no matter the obstacles in their path. Jayden's journey didn't end in that restaurant. It was only the beginning. What started as a moment of quiet defiance turned into a story of transformation and hope, not just for him, but for everyone who witnessed it. His resilience reminded the world that our worth is never for others to measure, but for us to define. "Sometimes the world tries to tell you who you are," his manager David Wilson had said, "but your worth isn't theirs to decide, it's yours to prove." As Jayden prepared for his first professional performance, his heart was filled with gratitude and determination. Every step forward was for the late nights, the sacrifices, and the belief of those who had stood by him. His story had already touched countless lives, inspiring others to see beyond the surface and challenge their own assumptions. We all carry stories that shape us, but what matters most is how we choose to write the next chapter. Jayden's courage shows us that dignity and grace can turn even the smallest moment into something extraordinary. Jayden's story is a testament to resilience and courage. Now it's your turn. What did this story mean to you? Share your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. If you found this story inspiring, give it a like, and please subscribe for more daily stories. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you'll always be the first to hear more incredible stories of hope and determination.